Well, good morning. Pastor Tom is actually away at his son's wedding this weekend, so let's remember to be praying for him as he enjoys a couple days of relaxation as well. You know, Kevin Carter was a South African photographer who's probably best known for his powerful documenting of many of Africa's most volatile political situations. He was born in 1960, interestingly enough, the year that Nelson Mandela's African National Conference was outlawed in Africa. He started out his career as a photographer, actually being a sports photographer, but in 1983, he soon moved to many of the front lines of Africans' most crumbling communities. Kevin was known for recording images of repression and anti-apartheid protests and starvation. In fact, if you Google his name this afternoon, you'll see some extremely powerful pictures. He's probably best known for his pictures taken in Sudan during the time of the famine. And many people believe that these pictures helped the world to, for the first time, wake up and take action to the devastation that was taking place there in the early 90s. He's probably best known for this picture. And I don't know how many of you have seen this before, but this is a picture that he took in 1993. And it's a picture of an emaciated girl collapsing on her way to a feeding center. And as you can see, there's a hungry vulture waiting in the background. This picture was first published in the New York Times and then in the Johannesburg Weekly. And very quickly, it swept the world and in many ways became an icon for what was happening in Sudan. The reaction to the picture was so strong that the New York Times actually published an unusual editor's note on the fate of the girl. It said that Kevin Carter had actually chased the vulture away and helped the little girl to the feeding center. But a few months afterwards, Kevin told an interviewer that the editor's note wasn't true. After he snapped the picture, he returned to his vehicle and drove on. And about an hour later, guilt-ridden for not doing anything, he says that I sat under a tree for hours. I smoked 2 packs of cigarettes, and I just cried. Well, on May 23rd, 1994, and 14 months after capturing that picture, Carter walked down an aisle at the Columbia University Memorial Library to receive the Pulitzer Prize for his photographic work in Sudan. And 2 months after receiving the Pulitzer, Kevin Carter was found dead from carbon monoxide poisoning in Johannesburg, committing suicide at 33. His red pickup truck was parked near a small river where he used to play as a child, and a green garden hose was attached to the vehicle's exhaust pipe that funneled the fumes inside the cab. Attached beside him, underneath his knapsack, was a note that started off by saying, "I am really, really sorry," he explained. "The pain of life overrides the joy now to the point where joy no longer exists for me." Time magazine wrote that the suicide note left behind was a litany of nightmares and dark visions, of a clutching attempt at an autobiography, self-analysis, explanation, and excuses. Another part of the note said, "I'm haunted by the vivid memories of the killings and the corpses and anger and the pain of starving or wounded children, of trigger-happy madmen, and of killer executioners." His father made a comment at Kevin's funeral, and he said, "Kevin always carried around with him the horror of the work that he did." You know, staring injustice in the face has a way of changing us and breaking us. Injustice can be a hard thing to look at. Recently, I heard an interview with Rick Warren where he said justice is an issue that few of Christ's followers, especially here in the West, take the time to truly wrestle with. And I wonder if that's true. This morning, I want us to begin the process of wrestling with this issue, not just in an intellectual way, but in a personal, soul-searching way. Specifically this morning, I want us to look at the book of Isaiah, chapter 58, verses 1 to 10, which you can find on page 526 of the Pew Bible in front of you. Allow me to read the first few verses. Isaiah says, "Shout it aloud and do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion and to the house of Jacob their sins. For the day after they seek me out, they seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them." You know, it's in these opening words of this passage that we're being reminded that the primary purpose of the prophets wasn't to foresee the future, but in fact it was to call God's people to repentance and to remind them what it means to live lives that are in keeping with their covenant. "Shout it out, don't hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet and announce to my people that they have been rebellious." These words probably wouldn't have been a surprise to the nation of Israel, but what their sins were, their rebellions and sins, are probably what would have caught them off guard. It's important to note here that God's not displeased with some rebellious bad behavior, but rather it is with what they were obviously considering their very good behavior that was warranting this rebuke from God. Isaiah pins down their problem and lets them know that it's these very actions, the shape and form of their so-called faith, that were revealing just how far from God they had wandered. They're saying, "Look at our humble fasting, yet Yahweh still does not notice us." In verse 3, we read, "Why have we fasted," they say, "and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please, and you exploit your workers." What was happening here is that the Hebrew people were caught actually worshiping worship. They had recently reestablished this temple worship in Jerusalem, and it had become their single-minded focus. This public practice of piety and this repeated ritualized fasting was actually starting to define their religious life. They were convinced that these acts of fasting were proving their faithfulness to God. And they were more than a bit peeved that despite all of their ritualized public displays, that God had not seen fit to answer their prayers. The people felt that God had turned a deaf ear to their problems. And the louder they seemed to shout to the Lord, it seemed that the voice of God became harder and harder for them to hear. In these verses, the prophet is telling them that even as they are worshiping, their intent is really only intended to serve their own interests. He says that their attention to fasting causes you to oppress all of your workers. Verse 4 and 5 reads, "Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife, and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast that I have chosen? Only a day for a man to humble himself? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed or lying on sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord?" Instead of being a humble practice, this fasting had literally become a very public, even a showy drama that was played out for the peers. A bowed head like a bulrush, lying in sackcloth and ashes, had become little more than props that were being used for these public exhibitions. These verses tell us that this competitive fasting had led to nothing but quarreling and fighting. Isaiah asks a rhetorical question: if this self-serving, self-centered, strife-inducing behavior is really what they believe makes a day acceptable to the Lord. In verses 6 to 10, Isaiah challenges the people with a new definition of a fast and a new understanding of what kind of rituals and activities God requires of his people. He's saying that at the heart of all of Yahweh's demands is nothing less than establishing genuine justice and mercy and compassion for everyone. Verse 6 starts out, it says, "Is not this the kind of fasting that I have chosen, to loosen the chains of injustice, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe him and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. And then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, 'Here I am.' If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing of a finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like noonday." Isaiah is reminding God's people that their behavior, a life that Yahweh requires, is one where everyone who truly wants to serve him lives a life of loosening the bonds of injustice, of letting the oppressed go free, sharing your bread with the hungry, and bringing the homeless poor to your house. You know, one especially telling requirement that was voiced by Isaiah is that we are not to hide ourselves from your own flesh and blood. An interesting passage. See, what had happened back then was what, in the aftermath of the economic hardships that they had been through, when extended family members had lost everything, their homes, their lands, their livelihood, and even their freedom, cutting ties with those who were no longer able to care for themselves had become commonplace. In no uncertain terms here, Isaiah was condemning this save yourself first type of mentality. In fact, he says that these acts of compassionate justice are in fact true worship. Isaiah is reminding the people that sitting in the temple and solemnly fasting is not worship when it is accomplished at the expense of or with disregard for other people's needs. The worship the Lord requires, he says, is the active incarnation of God's justice in the world. Do first, then pray. Or put another way, doing is the worship that God demands. He's saying that God's righteousness is something that needs to be experienced by the whole community and not just those who happen to be in the gated parts. Verse 10 says that if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, then your light shall rise in the darkness and your gloom will be like noonday. Isaiah likes to use the Hebrew word tzedakah, which defines any charitable endeavor and usually is translated by the word charity. It is one of those rich words in Scripture, one of those rich words in the Hebrew language that just no matter how hard we try, there is no word in the English language that can describe the complexity of tzedakah. It's a very rich word that literally means righteousness and justice. You know, charity is something that we're very familiar with. We hear someone is in need and we give some money or we give gifts to help them. But charity is really the first step in giving. Tzedakah is the second step. I've always loved Jesus' statement when he says, "No greater love does a man have than he lays down his life for his friend." He's saying here that there is love and then there is greater love. There is charity and then there is tzedakah. This passage in Isaiah is calling for us as his followers, as followers of Jesus, to a higher love, a love that changes and a love beyond merely giving.